U.S. correspondent. In 2019, he is responsible for reporting on the intersection of U.S. politics and the Palestine Solidarity Movement. He publishes two newsletters on the website, The Shift, which was mentioned in the flyer, but also Power and Pushback, which is the other newsletter that he publishes regularly on the website. His work has appeared in outlets such as The Intercept, In These Times, Truth Out, and The Appeal, and he is the author of the book Medium Blue, The Politics of MSNBC. Michael, it's a great privilege to have you with us. We look forward to this time together as we take a deep dive into what's been happening in our movement over the last year and a half. Um, Michael, I wanted to say, for many years, and especially since October 2023, your reporting has been invaluable in keeping Mondoweiss readers abreast of the latest developments in the Palestine solidarity movement in this country. I wonder if you could provide us with some of the highlights of what you have covered over the past 18 months and what stands out for you.
Sure. I mean, well, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. Very happy to be here. The last 18 months, I mean, the thing that immediately comes to mind, maybe obviously, is the encampments of last spring. Because, I mean, I think it's hard to overstate the impact. I think some of what we're going to get into later, I think, in terms of the recent wave of suppression is obviously connected to how successful and unprecedented those protests were. By the numbers, they were easily the biggest anti-war protests that we'd seen in the country since right before the Iraq War, so over 20 years ago. The anti-war movement in this country has gone through, I'd say, number of shifts and pitfalls. And, there's been studies about how the election of, say, like Barack Obama, obviously, like a lot of the protests that existed under Bush kind of dissipated, even though many of the policies in the Middle East were continued. So to kind of see young people out in their college campuses or out in the street, and really, I think the bravery of them was one of the most striking things, and something. I mean, just speaking with a lot of them who were very committed and had kind of, in talking to me, had assumed in some situations that they would probably get suspended or expelled or arrested, and in some situations, potentially not graduate. And many of those words and many of those comments were coming from people who went to pretty elite schools. And I think just the fact it ran the gamut, the people I talked to from all over, from people who were Palestinian, who'd been organizing, connected to this, for most of their lives, to people who had just come around to protest and the issue since October 7th. That's the thing that really stands out when I think of the last 18 months, just kind of the vast impact that movement and that moment had, starting at Columbia and then kicking off a wave, which shows us that, any protest can potentially kick off that kind of wave. And I think we are now kind of like in a time where we are dealing in many ways with the backlash to that progress. So yeah, I'd say that the encampments definitely.
Sticking with that theme of the encampments, many of us on this webinar experienced the Gaza Solidarity encampments in one way or another, either by actively participating in them or offering community support. Those of us that visited the UNC encampment in the spring, so about a year ago, were struck by how the atmosphere of beloved community. That was really an amazing environment. Could you share with us your sense from your reporting about how these encampments came to take on this quality and why this was important? I'm not sure every encampment had exactly that same feel, but I talked with friends in Chicago and on the West Coast and in the Northeast, and many of them described this same quality of trying to model the world that the students wanted to belong to and to be part of, and to and it seemed to be marked by this quality of beloved community.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with that. Every interaction I had in terms of the encampments had that type of feel as well. And it's kind of ironic that they were now kind of betrayed by obviously lawmakers and the media in kind of the opposite way, that they were purposely violent or antagonistic. Um, I mean, I think it had something to do with a little what I said in the first question, where I think a lot of people were attracted to this movement and came from all different kinds of places. And I think something that I heard from activists consistently who have been working on this for a while is this real idea that Palestine was becoming a social justice issue among progressive people in much the same way other issues have become in recent years, whether it's Black Lives Matter or anything else. And I think that we really kind of have seen this push over the last, I'd say all the work that's been done by groups like BDS, dating back to like the mid 2000s, like the Palestine movement domestically, I think has made so many strides over the past decade, but particularly in the last 5 years. And I think in many ways it was able to learn from previous movements that we've seen in the United States and across the world for that matter, and kind of pick out parts that worked or maybe disregard parts that didn't work. But I think whenever there's something that happens like this, whether it's Ferguson or whether it's the Gaza encampment or um, there's always kind of like the backstory, or the mainstream media might catch up to it in that moment, but there's so much that goes on before it, and so much organizing, and so much protest, and so many meetings that people throw where only 4 or 5 people show up, and it all leads to something like what happened at Columbia and that spark, and that really doesn't happen unless that groundwork was laid. So that's a big takeaway for me speaking to Palestine activists since I've had this job and before. And I think that really informed that community atmosphere. And like I said, a lot of people I talked to, some of them committed activists to this issue and other issues connected to U.S. foreign policy. And then there's other people I talked to who were arrested, who got arrested at their first protest, who had never thought who were maybe in other connected to other organizing efforts, labor issues or economic issues, and hadn't really stepped into like the foreign policy world in any capacity, and were kind of compelled when they saw what was happening on their campus, or when they saw the way that their administration or police were reacting. So I think it was a very inviting movement in that sense, and kind of organic in that sense. And I think it really showed anybody who showed up. I think you got that sense of camaraderie and community among the students.
Mhm. Um, in addition to that, loving and caring, joyful even environment, we know that the student movement in these encampments had very clear demands of their universities. Most of the student delegations wanted their universities to publicly join the calls for a ceasefire, to stop arming Israel, and to divest from companies that were facilitating and profiting from the occupation and the apartheid in the West Bank, and of course, the genocide in Gaza. Could you describe from your reporting how these demands were met by the universities, and specifically where do things stand now with these demands that the students and their faculty supporters raised, especially given the authoritarian crackdowns and the the shutting down of the movement?
Well, I have to say that there really has not been much in terms of meeting these demands. I mean, there was some public, I don't know what you would like, some PR stuff, maybe like Brown University, for instance, where I live next to, there was acknowledgement that they were going to have a meeting with students to talk about potentially a vote to divest or something to that effect. So there was that kind of stuff. There was also like the president of Wesleyan University, I think, wrote an op-ed explaining why he didn't call the cops on his students. But I've had multiple students talk to me from that school who faced arrests for protests that were connected to the encampment, actually just in recent days. So I think I do not think any or many of these demands were met in any capacity. It's also worth pointing out that, especially at private institutions, one of the demands was just to see the books themselves, because at many schools, the students have no idea how invested their school and administration is in Israeli apartheid or in genocide in Gaza. There's no transparency on that level, which speaks to deeper issues, obviously, within our university system that we might get into later. So I'd say they really weren't met, and I think on the contrary, now we are seeing with the Trump administration, another thing I'm sure we'll talk about later, but um, threatening to pull or already already pulling billions of dollars from schools um, in contracts and grants that were already congressionally approved, which people don't often point out, like the Columbia money had already been approved by Congress. Um, uh, Pulling this with the intent of getting schools to kind of bend to their will. And so far, we've seen schools do it. I mean, we just saw Harvard nix the team that ran their Middle East Studies department. I believe they got rid of their divinity school as one of the programs, like the Religion and Peace program. Which was very committed to this issue. We saw them change the rules in terms of rules and regulations in terms of who is allowed to hold protests in student buildings. And we saw Columbia, that's just a few things they did, but we saw Columbia do much of the same. They instituted a new mask ban, for instance. They suspended over 20 students who were connected to the occupation of Hamilton Hall last spring. And these were all asks from the Trump administration, which is still, as I speak, still withholding this money, but had sent Columbia a letter basically implying that if they did these things, they might change their mind, and they immediately complied. So I think a big story especially in over the past month since the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil is really universities throughout this country kind of cowering and bending to the will of the government when it comes to this issue, and being complicit in helping them when it comes to their like overall suppression of the Palestine movement on campus.
Um, this past year, since the encampments were shut down, has been traumatic for many of the students. You mentioned some of the environment, the crackdowns, the police brutality, academic suspension, losing access to campus housing, losing graduate fellowships and scholarships, in some cases being denied their degrees, as well as in some cases facing these criminal charges. One UNC student activist spoke of her dream of studying at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and anticipating an ethic of care for her time here. Instead, she said, these are her words: the administration hates us. They couldn't care less about us. They don't just want us to be quiet, they want to get rid of us. Talk a little bit more about the McCarthyite repression of pro-Palestinian activism that we're seeing across the country, and specifically the impact it is having on students and academic communities.
Well, it's hard to know where to begin these days. I mean, I guess I would begin by saying the point of this kind of repression is always to have a chilling effect on people. That's the entire idea. When Marco Rubio says last month that he's revoked at least 300 visas, and that he plans to revoke more, and that there's no reason for you to be in the United States if you're going to protest, essentially. That sends a direct message, I think, obviously, to international students thinking about coming to the United States to study. And by the same token, we've seen multiple people in this country who have been scooped up, snatched on the street by ICE, still being held in detention centers, people who have self-deported to avoid being targeted because they knew they were going to be arrested. I think it has quite obviously it has an effect on students' ability to speak out, and just the ability overall to organize when these fears are kind of rippling through the community. And I think we have seen some faculty and some professors also organize against their schools in terms of their schools kind of playing ball with the Trump administration. But I think it's very hard to overstate the overall impact. I wrote a newsletter a few weeks ago, kind of specifically about the Columbia situation, and there was a New York Times article that was written shortly after Khalil was arrested in New York. and it quoted Jelani Cobb, who is the Columbia Journalism School's dean, and a student had another professor, an adjunct professor named Stuart Carl, had told a group of students to stop posting about the Middle East on their social media pages altogether, that they shouldn't have commentary on their social media page about the Middle East. And when a Palestinian student objected and said that, Columbia was promoting censorship here and kind of cowering to the Trump administration, Cobb said, "Nobody can protect you. These are dangerous times." And I don't think he was saying it in kind of an insidious way. I think he was just being truthful. I really think a lot of people at these schools, regardless of what they think personally, are kind of between a rock and a hard place when it comes to this stuff. And we're in a situation where we're literally seeing people, like I said, snatched off the streets, and it has had a real effect, I think, on the organizing. But I also would say it makes the organizing that's going on now that much more impressive, because we've seen since Khalil's arrest hundreds and thousands of people in the street. We just saw a huge Palestine protest last Saturday in DC. Those protests, those anti-Trump protests that were all across the country last week too, I think over 1,400 of them or something across the country. Although the organizers didn't, I thought it was kind of curious that the organizers, Indivisible and other kind of liberal groups, didn't mention the issue of Gaza on the flyers or on the messages for people to come out. You did see, for people who showed up at those things in many of the cities, there were Palestinian flags. There were people who addressed the issue, and have certainly addressed the issue of McCarthyism that we've seen from the Trump administration. So I'd say it's absolutely having an effect. The effect is intentional, but we're seeing a mass movement kind of react to that, and we are certainly continue to see kind of activism in the face of all this repression.
Let me ask you about the pro-Israel Zionist groups that have assembled hit lists of students whose opinions on Israel and genocide groups like Betar,
Yep.
and how they have been engaging in doxing and smear campaigns and harassment, and then now apparently collaborating with university officials and government officials to specifically target and punish student and faculty activists. Could you tell us what you know and what you've learned about how extensive this work is? I mean, there are a lot of these Zionist groups. They've been active for a long time, but it seems like now they've really been coordinating very closely with governmental officials. I heard John Fetterman, the Democratic senator from Pennsylvania, was involved in meeting with Betar activists, and folks from ICE and DHS have been coordinating with some of that, and some have suggested the names that they have and the information about them has been gathered already by some of these Zionist hit groups. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, and where things stand at this point with that?
Yeah, it's actually interesting you bring up Batar. I mean, they're kind of like the most, I'd say, um, aggressive kind of hardcore group. And actually, just before we got on this call a few hours ago, I saw Richie Torres had a tweet kind of denouncing them, despite the fact that I believe, like Fetterman, there's actually some loose connections to the group. And I think Fetterman had a similar tweet where he kind of distanced himself from the group. Batar, people don't know. I mean, this group, I mean, they can just look on their social media. They purposely try to dox people. They call for them to be deported. They sent the Trump administration a list of, I forget how many, 5,000 people or something that they wanted thrown out. They do things like walk up to Palestinians on the street and hand them beepers, or pundits who are supportive of Palestine, like Norman Finkelstein, for instance. They believe they handed him a beeper, and they also disrupted a recent book talk that he gave. The beeper obviously is supposed to invoke the Israeli attack on Lebanon that killed a bunch of people, including a child. So that's Batar. I think uh, the interesting thing here is, the story doesn't start on October 7th, as many people say. It also, this story that we're talking about now in terms of the pro-Israel groups doesn't start when Mahmoud Khalil was arrested on March 8th. I think our website and a few other websites that cover this kind of stuff have been covering these groups for quite a long time. And just like I was talking about the activism kind of leading up to this moment, pro-Israel groups have also, done a lot of work to lead up to this moment. And, a website like Canary Mission, which is kind of run by a shadowy person, I believe, in the UK, who's been doxing kids for years with the intention of, making it hard for them to get jobs. I mean, I've had multiple people I've interviewed when they were young come back to me a couple years later and write me an email and ask if I can, edit the article with a pseudonym because they're afraid about Canary Mission potentially blocking them from getting some sort of position. That's the reality. I saw the New York Times had an article about Canary Mission kind of explaining who they were a couple weeks ago. But I'd say like these groups have been around for a long time, and I think the mainstream media is kind of catching up to it now because we're seeing it culminate in some really disturbing stuff in terms of deportations. But these groups have always been around for a long time, and some of them, I think, we have to say they've been complicit in getting us to this point. And not everyone is like Batar. So like a group like Hillel, which is a campus group, the
Mm.
largest Jewish campus organization, which claimed in some is extremely pro-Israel, has a rule that the group cannot organize with anti-Zionist groups, for instance, and their CEO of Hillel International CEO came out recently and kind of expressed public concern for Trump's moves in recent days and students getting snatched up and stuff. But it's hard to kind of take these sentiments seriously when Hillel has, consistently actually called for investigations into pro-Palestine students. They've called for censorship and suppression of Palestine students. And you have to wonder what people thought this was all going to lead up to, or where the investigations were going to go, especially when we always knew that Trump, or a politician like him, we might see him back in power. So yeah, I mean, like I said, in much the same way that this story didn't start, it didn't start at this current moment. It works the same way for the pro-Israel groups. They've been around for a long time, and they're attempting to work directly with the government in many situations. And another group I should throw out, just as I'm on the subject, is the ADL, who has also, expressed concern for what the Trump administration is currently doing, but has been calling on for quite a while. Recently was calling on the FBI to investigate students over alleged connections to terrorism because of Palestine protest. I think Batar gets a lot of headlines because of what they do and how kind of brash they are and over the top. But I'd say a lot of these groups, and for that matter, the Richie Torreses and the John Fettermans of the world, certainly bear a lot of responsibility for what we're seeing now.
Thanks for that historical perspective. Um, let's maybe take a step back and look more personally and broadly. I'm wondering, been at this for a while. What for you is the work of the journalist, as you understand it? What's sort of your self-understanding of the mission and the vocation of journalism, and what do you find most rewarding about it, and also the things that are challenging and difficult? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I find a lot rewarding about it. I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate what I do personally. I mean, what I do is pretty easy compared to, we have people on our staff who are in Palestine. A lot of what I do is covering, like bills that are going through Washington or whatever. But having said that, of course, you chip away, you hope that what you're doing is having some impact on the discourse. And I would say, beyond journalism, I think just working for an independent outlet, it's like independent media is so important to, I think, people and should be important to people as an antidote to kind of the mainstream media. And the last 20 years have not been particularly great for media generally, but especially independent media. We've seen a lot of, I think, good websites, magazines, periodicals go defunct, or places that used to do good work have to get bought out or have to pivot to video or something. So I think the examples of websites or papers or magazines that are kind of pushing back and exposing people to the truth is kind of few and far between. And even mainstream media, insofar as they do good work, as they do sometimes do good work, they've obviously had to scale back their operations over the last decade or the last 20 years. So I think just working for a place like Mondoweiss is very rewarding. It makes me feel good that we're able to offer that to people, and that we've built the community and kind of just the evolution of the Mondoweiss website, which kind of started as a blog by our founder Phil Wise, in the wake of things like the Iraq War, and as a way he had come out of like establishment media, and as a Jewish person who wanted to be able to interrogate things like Zionism or support for Israel, and then to develop more and more. When I came on in 2019, they were expanding like a little. I became the U.S. correspondent, and since then we've grown even more. And now we have people in different parts of the world, and a social media. We're still a pretty small staff, but I think just working for an independent place that has stuck it out and never kind of wavered to their commitment and is still around. I'd say that is probably the most rewarding and the thing I'm most proud of.
Mondoweiss is on everybody's speed dial on this webinar. I mean, we listen and read and count on the great reporting you all do. Is there a particular story from this most recent period, or even as long as you've been doing this work, that kind of stays with you? Something that left a special impact?
There's a lot of stories that have stuck with me, but I'd say the one that I've thought about the most in the last few weeks is a story I did in October of last year, so October of 2024. And this was a story that I did about, this was like the encampments had occurred, and everybody went home for the summer, or most people, and schools had kind of quietly shifted their protest policy. And the story was about, what kids were facing now that they were beginning to return to school in the fall, and what had changed. And this had run about a month before the election, so we didn't know at the time that Trump was about to become president. But the reason why it kind of stands out to me, and I thought about it a lot, is that one of the people I spoke to for that story was Mamadou Tal, who was a PhD student at Cornell, who at the time I was speaking to him because he had almost been deported under the Biden administration for participating in a protest, a Gaza protest. Cornell came very close to issuing, or was initially going to issue him a suspension that would essentially take away his visa. There was a lot of public pressure, and they backed down. But since the piece ran, as people probably have heard his story, he has left the United States for fear of being deported. He thought he was going to be, essentially disappeared the way that so many people have over the last few weeks. So I guess looking back on it, knowing what happened, what his words have kind of stuck with me. Something he said in that piece, he told me that it was very important. I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but he said we can't separate the what's happening at the school, so like the oppression from the police or the administration or lawmakers, from what's happening in Gaza. And he talked about how the two were linked. And he said that the fact that they couldn't be separated kind of showed that Palestine, or in protesting over Palestine, really got to the heart of the empire. And I really sat with that and thought about it, especially with all these draconian moves from the Trump administration, just thinking about why this issue is so important to them in a way that threatens them to the point where, you have to revoke hundreds of visas from people. So that stuck with me, especially based on what happened to him. And in that same article, I also spoke with a woman named Mara Finkelstein, who was the first tenured professor to lose her job over a pro-Palestine post. She had an Instagram post that criticized Zionism. She was taught at Middleborough College, and she lost her job as a result of that post. And she said something that I think also ended up being quite important, and I didn't really realize at the time how kind of important her words were, similar for a similar reason. She talked a little to me about the kind of state of the university um, in the United States right now, and kind of what it represented, and how, after 20 or 30 years of neoliberal policy, that colleges and universities have really moved away from their original intent, and they had become they've embraced this kind of donor model. And she brought up the fact that she didn't have to have sympathy for the people who fired her to realize that her school was kind of between a rock and a hard place, if their endowment was threatened, and if it was a question of whether to get rid of an anthropology professor or potentially, lose a lot of funding, that it wasn't really like a difficult decision for them to make. Um, and she really attributed to that, partially to like I said, to the past decades of educational policy. And I think obviously her words have also turned out to be very prescient, thinking about them now. I mean, and just in terms of like what these schools, like I said before, what Columbia and Harvard have done, and how they bent over backwards to get this money back from Trump, and how Trump has been able to wield that against these schools. I think those two people in particular, especially what happened to both of them, just their words, I've really thought about them a lot, especially during this like current wave of repression that we've seen.
Mhm. Um, the sort of shakedown politics with the universities that Trump has been practicing, Trump administration. Um, we know about the universities that have capitulated. Is there reporting that you could share with us about universities that have banded together or tried to band together and stand firm defending their essential academic mission? I have heard of some of that going on. It's usually pockets of faculty, but I just wonder if, with your exposure to the whole scene, if you'd say that that is at all a significant and hopeful trend, knowing that what most of us are focusing on is the high profile capitulations. What would you say about that other side of it? Those who are resisting this and trying to stand firm for the university being a place of ideas and diversity and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there are some schools, and we should say, like Princeton, for instance, their president has made some headlines because he's kind of, it was a similar situation. I think Trump froze, or I think he froze it. I don't think he just threatened, but something like 210 million over, quote unquote, anti-Semitism concerns. And, that's so far, that's um, a president who hasn't kind of played ball, who's kind of dug in his heels. Um, I don't know how long that how many people like that we'll see, or how long that will last. I also don't think, if we look at some of these lists, like Linda McMahon, who runs the education department now, put out this list, or re-release this list of 60 schools that are potentially about to face, consequences for not cracking down on anti-Semitism. So I think this stuff is going to keep on happening. We'll have to see how each individual school reacts. I'd say it's been tremendously disappointing, though. And as far as I know, unless I'm forgetting something, maybe somebody can correct me in the questions if I am, but the only example of a school kind of standing up for their student in any capacity, as we've seen so many students, we just saw this huge wave of schools find out that students, people probably saw over the weekend, all across the country, colleges and universities were finding out about students having their visas revoked. But this woman, this Turkish doctoral student, Ramisa Ozturk, at Tufts University, who was, people probably saw the video, snatched up in broad daylight in Somerville, Massachusetts, sent to a detention facility in Louisiana, much like Mahmoud Khalil. Tufts University actually joined her case, or submitted like a statement in it, basically saying, that she was, a great, regarded as a great student, as a great person. And in that case, the scary thing about that case is that it seems the reason why she was reported. And by the way, this connects to Canary Mission, a group that I referenced earlier. I believe she was the student who had expressed concern to a friend days before because Canary Mission had doxed her, which maybe the two things are connected. But anyway, she had written this op-ed in the Tufts student newspaper, which had basically criticized the school for rejecting the series of student resolutions. And the resolutions were like denouncing the genocide in Gaza, cutting, severing ties to Israeli apartheid. Very similar to resolutions that we've seen introduced at, dozens of schools throughout the country in recent years. And it's believed that she was potentially targeted because she wrote this op-ed. So Tufts went on the record in court and basically put out this statement, the president said all this, and also mentioned in the statement that the op-ed that was run in the school paper didn't violate any school rules and was well within, within what's acceptable in terms of, how Tufts understands it. So it's an extremely low bar. I should point out, like, this is just the idea of a school kind of like saying it's wrong that our student was snatched off the street and sent to Louisiana is an extremely low bar. But I think that speaks to how kind of depressing the reaction to this stuff has been, because as far as I know, the only school that has cleared that bar, at least in terms of the students who have been targeted, has been Tufts. So I'd say the response has been, like I said, pretty sad.
Yeah, yeah. Overall, the news from Gaza is pretty bleak and seems to be getting bleaker by the day. And similarly, the situation in the West Bank is dire. Many of us who love the Palestinian people and want only justice and peace for them are struggling with feelings of rage and deep sadness, and quite candidly, trying to fight off feelings of depression. From your perspective, and I know this is not an easy question, but where is hope to be found, and what signs can you show us of resistance and resilience, especially the resilience we see from the Palestinian people, solidarity, models of solidarity, and defiance?
So, I mean, I think the most, or in my opinion, the real, symbol of resilience and resistance has obviously been, the Palestinian people, particularly the people of Gaza, not just over the past 18 months, but, prior to that. And I think, it's kind of just a beautiful lesson for the world. And I think all those of us who do this work, I think it continues to inspire us and give us hope in ways that, I don't know, can't even in some ways be put into words, despite everything that's happened and in spite of everything that's happened. Um, Domestically, I think, obviously the activism has been very inspiring. Like I said, the students, people showing out in the streets or organizing or calling attention to this issue. But I think it's important, or it can be hard to remember this sometimes, because things can get so bleak, or look so bleak. But I think everything that we've seen, from Trump, people have often spoke about how Trump, even when he was elected in 2016, represented a kind of backlash politics in many ways, a backlash to the advances that we've seen in this country when it came to things like the civil rights movement. And I think in the same way, we have to acknowledge that, all the kind of repression and all these pushes that we've seen to suppress pro-Palestine thought and pro-Palestine sentiment is coming from, it is a backlash to, advancements and successes that have been made by the movement over the last 10 years, but I'd say particularly over the last 5 years. kind of as the BDS movement has gained more ground and got more support. I mean, I'm old enough to remember shortly after BDS started when it was kind of derided by many people, even on the left or among liberals, as kind of a joke and it would never amount to anything. And less than a decade later, you saw all these states passing laws criminalizing the boycott. And the states in this country right now, where if you want a state contract, you have to sign a piece of paper that literally says you will not boycott a foreign country. That foreign country being Israel. You just don't see that kind of stuff unless unless the powers that be, so to speak, or the ruling class are concerned about something. In much the same way, AIPAC, which is a big pro-Israel lobbying group, we've covered them at the site, since the site was created, almost 20 years ago. But their role in our politics has drastically changed in the last 3 years because a few years ago, AIPAC created a super PAC. They created actually two PACs. One PAC called the AIPAC PAC, which is they use for like smaller scale things, usually Republican races, and the other one called the United Democracy Project, which purposely doesn't have AIPAC or Israel in the title because they know Israel's brand is kind of eroding among the American people, so to speak. But with that move, AIPAC decided we're going to get involved directly in elections. We're going to show up to elections, and if somebody criticizes Israel in any capacity, we've seen them target prominent, like the few people in Congress who speak up on this issue. But we've also seen them target people who have barely, have put their name on one signature. It was just announced they're going to. They have a new 6-figure social media and television ad buy across 11 states to specifically target these 15 senators who backed these Bernie Sanders resolutions the other day. This vote wasn't even close. They only got 15 people in the Senate to vote these resolutions that were going to block one weapon sale. But it was worth 8.56 billion, I think, of weapons and munitions to Israel. And now they're going to target these senators. And it's interesting. John Ossoff, one of the senators from Georgia, Bernie had a very similar vote in the fall, and Ossoff voted for the resolutions, gave a pretty good speech explaining why he did it. He got criticized by pro-Israel groups. He's a vulnerable candidate. He's up for re-election next year. And lo and behold, this time around, he didn't vote for the resolutions. He didn't vote for them, presumably because he knew that a group like AIPAC would have targeted him if he did. And now they're targeting these senators. But I bring this all up because the fact that AIPAC is spending all this money out of nowhere, the fact that they needed a super PAC, the fact that Democratic Majority for Israel was created, which is like a kind of like a AIPAC light. It's like a group of Democratic insiders who try to push Israel within the Democratic Party and try to shut down people like Jabal Bowman or Cory Bush who have been on the wrong end of these lobbying groups. Just the existence of these groups, the fact that they're spending so much money, the fact that there's BDS laws, the fact that they're deporting people for threatening American foreign policy. I think it's all in response to the fact that the Palestine movement has really expanded in a way that was hard to envision. Again, those of us old enough to remember the Iraq War, when some of the stuff was even controversial among the left. It was hard to bring up this issue even at many protests that you went to at the time that were about U.S. foreign policy and were about the Middle East. So that's really shifted. It's a lot of what I cover at the site. And then when these things shift and they go a certain way, you are met, I think, with the backlash to those successes. And I guess this is all just a long-winded way to say, I don't know, this is hopeful, but I think it's important to remember the momentum is kind of on the side of the people who are fighting for Gaza. And I think the people who are in, positions of power kind of realize that, and they know they have to kind of make these moves in order to kind of stomp that out. And I think that's important to remember. And, every week, seemingly, we get a new poll that just kind of confirms this. Pew just released a new poll a few days ago showing that 53% of Americans now hold an unfavorable view of Israel. That's up from 42% in 2022. So it's a real thing. And it's a real problem for Israel, the Israeli government. It's a real problem for the United States. And I just think that's important context, and it's something to keep in mind when all this stuff is happening, when you're kind of looking for silver linings or glass half full types of interpretations. I think it wouldn't be happening unless on some level, this side and this movement wasn't winning.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank, thank you for that. Um, Last question before we turn it over to the audience. One of the things about this movement that has been especially inspiring to a lot of us has been the role of anti-Zionist Jews, the Jewish Voice for Peace, if not now, those groups that have done such amazing actions early on in the movement, really galvanizing support for Palestine. And then also this movement of collective liberation, that no one is safe unless all of us are safe. And we are the ones who will keep ourselves and each other safe. Um, uh, what would you say about the power and the potential of these movements challenging Jewish exceptionalism, challenging the charges of anti-Semitism uh, associated with and smearing pro-Palestinian speech and activism? Um, Maybe sort of assess the power of that voice and also the movement toward collective liberation and mutual security. What would you say about that part of it that seems also to have emerged over the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's getting, like I was saying before, I think there are more and more people kind of seeing through exactly what you're describing. This idea that pro-Palestine protest is inherently anti-Semitic, this idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Um, we've seen the Senate actually this week was supposed to vote, but the vote got delayed on. They were supposed to vote on the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which has effectively codified the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which provides examples of criticisms of Israel, which it deems to be anti-Semitic. So there's a real concentrated push for that, and I do think people are. I do think they're seeing. I do think they're seeing through it. I do not believe like those numbers that I was citing before from Pew. I just think when you look at the statistics and you look at the numbers, the numbers are clear, but it's also just self-evident, I think, to people who have watched a genocide unfold on their phones, who have seen some of the most terrible videos and photos and read harrowing testimonies over the last 18 months, that they see the stuff and they know this is not right. This cannot be justified, and the justifications for it obviously have no connection to this idea of anti-Semitism. And I think the words ring especially hollow coming from this administration of all administrations, which has multiple members who themselves have kind of have been connected to actual anti-Semitism, and has multiple members of administration or former advisors, people within the context of Trump land, who have literally given fascist salutes in recent months. It's hard to hear those types of people talk about we have to deport people in order to crack down on anti-Semitism. I think a lot of people are seeing through it, and I think it's too early to see where the movement is heading. But I think, like, if we look at U.S. history, movements have often adapted, not just based on success, but also based on repression, and have had to change in many ways and shift and move. And I think we're still on. We are. We'll. The book is still open in terms of what impact this will have on our politics, and also what impact it will have on Palestine organizing and the greater left. I think the Red Scare and McCarthyism and things like that obviously had a profound impact on our politics and the way that we're able to organize in ways that I don't even know if people, have completely understand them. And I think the same can obviously be said about something like COINTELPRO, which Nixon's war on the left really changed the way that people could organize and changed kind of what came next. So I think we're gonna see kind of what happens in the coming days, weeks, months, years. But again, I would go back to the fact that I think a lot of good groundwork or interesting groundwork has been laid in this country over the last 10 years in terms of the activism. And I talked to multiple activists who said that, for instance, like the Black Lives Matter movement during 2020, and the response in those protests, their ability to kind of link that struggle with the struggle in Palestine, and that sense of kind of movements intersecting, and this idea, like you said, that it's of collective liberation and everyone being safe together. I think that was all tremendously important work. I think sometimes people focus too much on, was this movement or was this protest successful, and they judge it in a specific way. But I think it makes much more sense to just see it as kind of a rolling, continuous thing where these movements are constantly bumping off each other and learning from each other and evolving, and bringing us to kind of a different place. So I think the struggle is tough, and there's a long road ahead, and obviously there's a lot of work to do in terms of fighting back about regards to what's happening now. But I think we're going to see some interesting resistance and activism in the coming months, from people who care about this issue passionately and have kind of devoted their life to it.
Thank you, Michael. Very thought-provoking, and I hope that the audience will be now able to pick up on some of these themes that we've been talking about. Let me first ask Kate or Burhan if they have any questions. We're not quite at the 8:30 hour. Anything come to mind for either of you to ask Michael?
I'm already seeing hands, so I would love to go ahead and give people a chance.
Okay, good. Good. We can come back to you.
Yeah.
I see Ted and Sharon Shofi, and then Elena Saberio. So Ted and Sharon, please go first.
Yes, I too, of course, saw the Pew poll numbers, and while I was definitely encouraged by it, I want to get on something here and see what you think about this. One of the problems, I think, is let's take that poll number. Let's say it's 52%, gone up quite a bit over the years now. Well, but how many, for example, of that 52% are willing to lose their jobs over it? Is it like a tiny, tiny percentage? So I go back to many, many years. We've all heard the thing, basically, well, but putting it differently, if you're looking at numbers, then you have to look at the saying that we really believe in. I think it was MLK as well as others, and that is you have to be able to shut it down. What are numbers? Numbers don't mean anything if you're not shutting something down. And so I think about that, and I realize that in my mind, maybe others have another thought. In my mind, the most successful real life experiment in this country is union. Unions actually do function, and they don't, not always perfectly, but they are powerful. And so, is there a way that anybody has a magic wand that we could operate almost like unions, and how does that all come together? And because I don't, I was at first very elated with that 52% number, and then all of a sudden I began to realize not many will leave their jobs for that. So therefore, and the other thought along the same lines is, shouldn't our lever that we're trying to push be in the right place? Like, to use bad language, we don't want to piss on a flat rock, which means, are we really pressing on the right lever? And we know that money makes the world go around for sure. So then we got this small group of 1% of the population that in fact runs the world. I mean, we know that's true. And so therefore, the old idea of just getting a bunch of people to vote for somebody, anymore, you got a Biden and you got a Trump, and what difference does that make? Big deal. So anyway, that's enough for that. I just wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point because, you know, that 52% number, and I should point out, like, the numbers are much higher whenever they do these polls, as you probably saw when they split them for Republican and Democrat, the Democratic numbers are much higher. I thought that Pew poll was interesting because that's the first time I'd seen the Republicans shift a little. They're usually pretty, it goes in the opposite direction. But at any rate, I think that becomes the very important question, because I think Israel can, even if the brand of Israel is eroded on the left, or on, you know, on a wider level among progressives and liberals and Democrats, and even if they sympathize more with Palestinians than they do with Israelis, which Gallup poll says that they do over the past few years, it just becomes one of many issues where the base is to the left of the lawmakers. So it's like we have poll after poll showing us that most Democrats support Bernie Sanders' like domestic agenda, but, you know, Joe Biden got elected. So that it just becomes another one of those issues. Now, you know, the classic question, what is to be done? I think I would say that I agree with you that you need a lot of people who are willing to lose their jobs and willing to get arrested and willing to go on the street. But I would also say there, throughout, you know, U.S. history, the reality is, like, when you look at the numbers of some of these movements, whether it's civil rights or anti-Vietnam, it doesn't have to be, you know, the vast majority of the population who are willing to do that in order to shift policy. And I think we've seen more and more people willing to do those things. I also think that movements, as they go along, they kind of learn, you know, I've seen a lot of people interrogate and kind of think about these kind of mass protests where a bunch of people get arrested, they go to jail, they get out. It's like you know, everybody takes photos, and question kind of like, is that the best use of time? I mean, I'm just a journalist. I don't know what the best use of people's time is or what the most effective way to do activism is. But I have seen very interesting analysis in terms of people saying, well, maybe we should spend less time with these big high profile protests and more time kind of like organizing away from the spotlight, or, you know, kind of secretive, so to speak, in terms of our next move. So I'll be interested to see what happens. But I certainly agree with you that the numbers can only get you so far. I mean, it could be 85% of people who think Israel was bad. The U.S. could still keep sending them weapons. There has to be obviously something that connects the two things. And I think the real internal question is how to do that.
Okay, Elena.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for holding this space. It buoys me to have a little bit even political ed, you know. Michael, you are a rock star, and I am humbled. Two questions. Rutgers, if I'm not mistaken, has also asked for Big Ten universities to coalesce and stand together around this issue and supporting students. I don't know if that's factual or not, or if I'm just mishearing that. And my second question is, how much validity do you think this administration, or moron Marco Rubio, has put in? There's a person that lives in Chapel Hill, works in Durham, a physician who created an organization called North Carolina Coalition for Israel, and is going around to college campuses videotaping students, particularly, well, I don't know, I shouldn't say particularly, this is my speculation, particularly, let's just say they're students. How much validity and how much weight do you think someone who has an org and maybe doxing and sending this to someone that we don't know, what can be done? Thank you.
Sure. Well, the Rutgers thing, I had seen one statement from the president. I can't speak to, they might have been one of the schools that put out a pretty good statement on the issue. I know I did see the other day that they had multiple students that had their visas revoked. So I can't speak specifically beyond that. The one statement I saw from President, I believe Holloway. In terms of what can be done about those organizations, it's a great question. I don't. It's obviously a scary time because there's this. It's hard to know kind of where some of these groups end and where lawmakers begin. I think, Trump, dating back to 2016, has kind of ushered in this era of I don't know what you call, like, the alt-right kind of being directly connected or colluding with politicians. Like Laura Loomer was at the White House the other day. Like, just these kind of wild people from the internet. And in terms of what can be done about the orgs themselves, I think it's scary. I guess I'm answering my own question here, but it is scary because I believe many of them seemingly have a certain level of support from lawmakers. We were talking before about how multiple lawmakers had met with these kind of Batar adjacent groups and are now kind of attempting to deny that or separate themselves from the group. But I'm not really sure directly what can be done to stop those organizations from doing this. I just think that I would just say that I've been struck by the amount of young people who are not kind of deterred by this and who have continued to do the activism. And I would say the whole intent of these groups, obviously, much like the same intent as the lawmakers. The suppression, the chilling effect is the idea. The idea is that if you get involved in protests, you could potentially be doxxed, that you could lose a job. I saw the other day there was somebody in a very expensive apartment in New York who was hurling bags of excrement on protesters who were out protesting for Gaza. So we've seen very disturbing stuff, and I think we'll continue to see it. And I think, social movements and protest movements have always been met with this kind of counterinsurgency and, counter protests. And sadly, we, those connections to the government and that web remains kind of mysterious. And I know I can say, like, even in Mondoweiss, like, we've attempted to do some work and tried to figure out, where certain people behind certain things, so to speak. And a lot of it is pretty difficult to do. So I would just say it's a hard thing. I'm not exactly sure how to combat it, but I would say that I've been impressed by the amount of people who attempt to meet it head on, or have continued to protest and do their activism in the face of it.
All right. I see. I've seen three hands in this order: Laura, then Mary Lou, and then Jim and Cindy. So, Laura, you're up.
Oh, hi. Thank you. Yeah, I was just, I'm glad you have some optimism, Michael, because I'm feeling like from what I can see, the student activism around Gaza seems to have really died down, but maybe it's just taken another form. And I fear that as students see the repercussions now more and more all the time towards students getting expelled, not getting their degrees, thrown in prison, deported, and learn about the consequences it has even over a long term for these people. And that's something I really fear. I just fear that the effect will be kind of a crushing of that activism, because I don't know if I'm right, but it feels like this moment seems different than movements in the past historically. And I do go back to the Vietnam era, and I don't remember ever seeing a movement where you had all these organizations and who were going out of their way to wreck the lives of these student activists. I mean, the Canary Mission and all. I was at a rally yesterday, and suddenly this a Jewish law student burst out crying, and she said, it's just so much. We were talking about all the law firms that are capitulating. And so they see all this institutional capitulation. They see the effect of these groups going after their fellow students. And my fear is that, it's just going to have a dampening effect on activism.
Yeah, I mean, those are very valid concerns. I think anybody who does this work or who covers it has them consistently. it's, yeah, I mean, I think we've all had moments of reflection, and I think if people do not get to the point that you're describing occasionally, I would think something was off or wrong. I don't know how anybody can look at what's happening and always be kind of optimistic and rosy. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm especially optimistic. I just think that I do think it's a reaction to a certain level of momentum, and I am interested in what ends up happening on the other side. I think that, to your point, there have been a number of groups, as far as I know, in terms of just people I've spoken to who do this kind of work, who have kind of shifted their tactics in many ways, and have kind of thought about different ways to approach it, outside of the normal kind of ways that we've been describing in terms of protest. And you know, I think if people stop fighting, obviously, sadly, all is lost. Khalil's case, people may have seen, actually today, shortly before this call, the government had to submit a file basically showing what evidence it had that they were attempting to deport this person. And there was a memo, 2-page memo signed by Marco Rubio, which basically just says we can deport him because we think he's anti-Semitic. They're relying on a provision from a immigration law from 1952, which was used to attempt to deport, ironically, Jewish people from the Soviet Union who were suspected of being, scientists who were connected to the Soviet regime. So they are not even pretending that many of the people that they are detaining have committed a crime. They're attempting to invoke this idea, which seems tremendously shaky legally, but who knows? I mean, obviously this administration has ignored courts, which is the other concerning part of this entire story. But just this idea that anti-Semitism, as the Trump administration views it, threatens American foreign policy. And if you do that, according to this memo, that they reserve the right to deport you, which is tremendously disturbing. The hearing continues. Actually, the next court date is tomorrow. So we'll see. I think in the coming days, we're going to see how the judge reacts to that memo. And I think some of that will dictate kind of what happens next. I think all these things are kind of moving their way through court. I follow this Just Security pretty consistently for my pieces, and they have a running tracker of all the lawsuits kind of launched against the Trump administration. So I think that's somewhat important. But having said that, I think obviously the courts will not save us. We know from history that at the end of the day, it's not going to be the law. It's going to be people and what they're willing to do, and how they react to this, which is going to kind of dictate what happens next. So having said all that, I guess I would agree with you insofar as I think it has impacted student protests. And I think even the crackdown last spring, impacted it coming back to school. And I talked to a lot of students about that, how they had to kind of change their tactics because the universities had adapted to what they're doing. So I think it's going to be an ongoing kind of process, and we're going to see kind of activism take different forms, and it still remains to be seen kind of what happens on the other side, or what forms those add up to, if that makes sense.
Mary Lou.
So I think I'm on, right?
You're on.
Yeah, thanks. I also have two questions. They're actually rather personal in the sense that I've been at this work for 30 years. And I've had the sense that sometimes I need to work with the establishment in order to continue my work. And in that light, I'm happy to say that our church has now become an apartheid-free church after years of education and struggle. And we're getting ready to do at least a monthly protest in a very open location on the boulevard. We'll invite the community to join us. And I'm just asking the question, within the church, since we have this word that the church is not a sanctuary place anymore, does that give us a little bit more of a way to give the public reality? That's number one. The other is, for me personally, I normally do a lot of traveling, not to the Middle East at the moment, but I have family living overseas. And I'm just wondering about the wealth of information that is in my possession through my phone and through the internet. And yes, I am a citizen of the United States and of Brazil, but what kind of protection does that give me?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I think that's really the concern in terms of what happens next, because we've seen historically how these things kind of start, and the most vulnerable people in society are generally targeted first. And what's disturbing is the Trump administration has floated this idea of sending. I haven't mentioned this throughout the entire call, but obviously what's happening to protesters and students is part of a much wider deportation program aimed at people from all kinds of countries, not just the Middle East, and not just people who are connected to this movement. And that the Trump administration has kind of floated this idea publicly in recent days, as everybody's probably seen, of sending U.S. citizens who they say will, of course, have committed the most heinous crimes to foreign prisons in places like El Salvador. The phone thing is the phone thing. I've been thinking about that a lot, because one of the people the woman from Brown University, who was deported, who was the kidney transplant specialist, had been in Lebanon and was basically, she was the one that was deported, despite there was a federal court order ordering her to be kept in the United States, but she was sent anyway. And she was the one that was sent because the agents had said they had found, things on her phone that were supportive of Hezbollah or Iran, the Iranian government. And people probably saw there was also an announcement this week that immigration is going to start potentially looking at people's social media to check for examples of anti-Semitism, which, the memo that came out on that, they kind of revealed that they're obviously not talking about anti-Semitism. They're talking about, have you supported Hamas, or groups like Hamas or Hezbollah? And I assume the qualifications or the criteria for that is going to be tremendously broad. And one wonders, like, if somebody is attempting to apply for a visa and they've tweeted an article about, like, I tweeted an article from Mondoweiss about how the U.S. should stop sending Israel weapons, does that constitute supporting Hamas? I think it's a very scary time when it comes to that. And congratulations about your church. I think, I mean, like, the use of that type of stuff, we cover it all the time. I think it's obviously tremendously important in terms of the movement.
Okay, I saw in this order Jim and Cindy, and then I also saw Sophia had her hand up. I did see that, Sophia. So you're after Jim and Cindy. Jim, Cindy, go ahead. You're muted, Jim.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. And my comment and question actually relates to something you were just saying a few minutes ago. I wanted to point out that when Khalil was first detained, they said that his presence or activities in the United States would have serious adverse foreign policy consequences. And I think it's important to listen to that, say, yes, that is exactly the intent. And I pray to God that every one of us in our activism and our protesting is having adverse consequences for U.S. foreign policy as it currently stands. And so it ties to your point about were getting their attention. And I don't remember the quote, but I imagine many of you do, of, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they try to silence you, and then you win, something like that. And so the cost is going up, there's no doubt, but we have to keep on. My question, I had heard a bit of analysis from one of these professors who studies fascism and authoritarianism, and talking about that in some respects, what's going on with the universities, the attacks on the universities right now, they've seized upon the Israel-Palestine issue, but the broader intent is to really just get the capitulation of the university system in this country, all issues. And I'm wondering to what extent you think that's the case, and whether universities might wake up to that and realize that they can't just capitulate on this one issue and then be scot-free. Do you think they might wake up to that in time?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, I don't have high hopes. I wish I did. I think the reality is, I was talking before, and it's a cliche, but this idea that, going for the most vulnerable people first. I think, Gaza in many ways is kind of the first thing, because it has this built-in kind of protection. Obviously, I think it's one of the reasons, this idea that you can invoke anti-Semitism, the fact that, Israel has been such a strident ally of the United States since its existence, the fact that you have so many, virtually every lawmaker on its side. It's pretty easy, with all that at your back, to go at protesters. And I think the schools, and maybe this is what you're saying to an extent, but I think the schools are making a massive mistake if they think it's going to end there, in terms of what happens next. Because just like, as we've talked about, this is not a new project for pro-Israel groups. It's also not a new project for the American right, to look to destroy the educational system, or, defund it, for that matter. I always go back to that line. I forget the name of the Reagan advisor who, back during Vietnam, when Reagan was the governor in California, and he shut down all the state schools at the height of the protests over the bombing of Vietnam and Cambodia, there was that advisor who came out who held a press conference. He had worked for Nixon before, and he was kind of trying to defend the decision. And, he had that, he told the reporters that the idea that you could let you ran the risk potentially, with colleges letting anybody in, like the kind of people that would protest. The problem with that was you might end up with an educated proletariat. And he said that if that happened, it could be dynamite. And it's the word he used. And I love that moment because, a lot of times you have to find stuff like that, like in an internal document, or like, two lawmakers talking to themselves, and then you see like the redacted file like 30 years later. But that's just an amazing example of like the ruling class saying what it actually means. We can't have people actually coming here, from the lower class and learning about how society works and protesting foreign policy. It's not the intent of the university, essentially. And everything that the right has done kind of since that moment has been, in that spirit, in my opinion, is trying to move it to, the idea of the university being a place for the elite, being a marketplace, not being a place where you kind of learn about the world around you, and you learn how to, help society and cooperate, and you learn about different cultures. These ideas are being attacked, and this is why we've seen, all these attacks on, things like diversity programs. Gaza is part of this much wider attack that we've seen from the right. So I think you bring up a great point, because it's obviously not going to stop with this. And if they can withhold money, and they can get Columbia to bend on X, Y, and Z as it relates to Gaza, and then what prevents them from doing this to any other school and getting them to bend on everything else? And if that's the case, and if we don't have more people standing up, I think we have a legitimate question as to what university even is, or what it means, going forward in this country. because a lot of these schools like Columbia and Harvard, I mean, if you go on their websites and you read like their, mission statements and what they, and their history and kind of like the things that they embrace and allegedly stand for, we have to ask ourselves, like, is this all nonsense? Is this all words? Is this all BS? Because if we end up on the other side of this, everything could be potentially different in terms of how we view these institutions. And I think it's already happened to an extent over the last 30 years. But I haven't seen a lot of proof that, I mean, maybe you're right. Maybe some schools will stand up when they realize it goes beyond this. But the scary part is, as these things generally go, it might at that point be too late. I think it's always important to remember that, Steve Bannon had that vision when he, the former Trump advisor, this idea of just flooding the zone, so to speak, that you do stuff so fast that media and, the opposition politically can't react. And I think that's the situation we're in now. Even just this one issue, it's hard to keep up with, let alone all the other, moves that the administration is making. So I fear maybe if that doesn't happen, if we don't see people stand up, that it might when people start realizing it might in fact be too late. So I was optimistic before. This kind of a bleak answer. And
Thank you.
Judith, I see your hand.
Thank you. I'm glad. Thank you. Because I was not being able to do it electronically. So I actually did it physically. And thanks for seeing. I wonder, some of the Western newspapers have made a big deal out of protests against Hamas in Gaza. And I'm going to say something to people about the Seder, we're going to try to have a few sad minutes about the too many people who have been killed. And I was allowed to add the Palestinians and Israelis together, who are standing together. But I was also allowed to add the good news that the Palestinians in Gaza are saying they don't want Hamas anymore, at great risk. It's a scary thing to say. Do you know much about those demonstrations and the Western newspapers' excitement about this? I think the Times and the other newspapers have mentioned this.
Yeah, they certainly. I mean, I'd agree with you. It's a topic that has been embraced by Western newspapers. It's also been embraced, I think, by a lot of. I've seen a lot of like pro-Israel lawmakers embrace it and use it as kind of a justification for what Israel is doing, like this idea. The other day, the State Department spokesperson, when they were asked about the medics being picked off and killed, just simply said, everything that happens in Gaza is Hamas's fault, essentially. I mean, that was the answer from the Trump administration. It doesn't really matter what Israel does. And I think some people who believe that I've seen them share a lot of the anti-Hamas protest stuff online, attempting to make the point that, like, oh, even the Palestinians know Hamas is bad. This is why Hamas has to hand over the hostages or comply with Israel or what have you. I don't cover the issue directly, but I would encourage everybody to go on our site, because we have a couple great reporters based in that area. Tariq, my colleague Tariq, and Qassam, and they've both covered the issue. There was a piece that ran on March 28th at our site called anti-Hamas Gaza demonstrations reflect desperation as Israel strangles and bombards the Strip, where he covered it pretty extensively. And I know they've both been working on it, and they kind of, you know, I mean, we obviously pride ourselves on kind of taking, providing analysis that maybe you don't find in the mainstream. So I know he got into kind of the nuances of that movement and who's involved. So I can't speak to it that extensively, but I would recommend checking out his work.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Sure.
Friends, we've come to the 9 o'clock hour, and there are some good comments in the chat. Let me just read a couple of them. In what we were just talking about, Laura says several journalists in Gaza have pointed to Israel's role in encouraging those anti-Hamas demonstrations. And earlier, Rula made the point that universities will lose students, international students who have critical thinking and potential for improving society. And this is a great loss for the U.S. and hope these students who get sent away will end up enriching other countries who are not Zionist, such as perhaps Ireland. So the gifts that come from these international students with real conscience about Palestine, it's a loss for us, but it could be a gain for others. Is there any last question before we close?
No, could I just encourage Michael to follow those students, some of the students who've been expelled or even deported? I'm really, over a longer term, I want to see what happens to them. What are the consequences in this new era of standing up?
Oh, yeah. So I should have mentioned this earlier, but we actually I'll put this in the thing, but we just launched maybe I did say it, I forget. We launched a new newsletter a few weeks ago, specifically about Palestine repression of the Palestinian movement, but also activism. So basically cover the Palestine movement and subsequent repression. But the one that went out on April 1st, we ran down every person nearly who has been targeted by this and kind of covered what we know about each case so far. And we're going to keep on doing that kind of work. So I'd encourage people to check out and subscribe to that newsletter. I think it's in the comments. But yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. We're going to continue covering them.
We're at wrap up time. I did want to also remind everybody that part of what we set out to do in having this joint webinar was to call attention to the importance of independent media. And I see Sophia's face on the screen here. And so, Sophia, maybe if you could just say a word about Mondoweiss and how people could support Mondoweiss and your invaluable reporting, that would be welcome if you would like to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And we're really excited about this partnership, the work that you're doing, educating the communities in North Carolina. It's really important. We're really thankful to be in partnership with you. And thank you, Michael, today for taking your time after a long working day to be here. I just want to say I'm incredibly proud of the work that my colleagues do at Mondoweiss. It's pretty obvious why supporting Mondoweiss is a good idea. Just listening to Michael and before Yumna on their work, it speaks for itself. So I know there are a lot of people here who already do that, but if you can support our work in all kinds of ways, promoting it, sharing it, reading it, and of course, supporting it financially, it means so much, and your support goes a long way. 80% of our supporters, 80% of our work is funded by individual supporters, not big bucks, just regular people that care about the news. So we really appreciate all of them, and a lot of them are in this room as well. So just wishing you all the best. I know there's some struggles, local struggles, and I think Michael has always been very good at pointing those. I know you have some struggles with the courts, or what is it, the Supreme Court justice. So keep at it. Those struggles are really important. And something I think, Michael, you could say maybe when we are desperate, you always say, well, they're spending all this money just to beat one race, just to get at Summerlee or someone else. And I think Michael always gives us that perspective of, if they're spending this much money, it means they're pretty desperate. So I always appreciate what Michael brings to the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sophia. Let's give Michael expressions of our thanks for this evening. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Michael.
Michael.
Very
Thank you
helpful,
so much.
invaluable reporting. Thank you
you.
for giving us your time and your wisdom. And thanks to all of you for coming. We're all involved in this struggle. We're all making contributions to the movement. Keep up your spirits. Let's do this for free Palestine, and let's keep at that work. So thanks to all of you. Thanks again, Michael. It's been a great joy to be in partnership for these webinars, and all the best to all of us as we continue our work.
Thank you all. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you, Michael. Thanks everybody for being with us and for your continued support. Thank you.
Thank you
Good
for
night,
having me.
everyone.
Good night.